This module is one of 6 that focus on organic matter, its characterization, and levels of accumulation in mesohaline organic rich systems. This first module looks at feast or famine ecosystems in mesohaline settings and how that particular geohydrology encourages pulsing accumulations of organic matter to the floor of perennial saline water bodies. The next module will look at how the processes of organic accumulation and preservation are aided by salinity fluctuations and density stratification in saline water bodies. This carries on from an earlier module where we looked at heliothermy and the nature of density stratification in brine bodies. Next, we'll have a look at what lives in a variety of saline geosystems, what are the types of plants, animals, algae, bacteria and archaea that live in these systems. And that leads into a discussion of how we can utilize this knowledge of what lives in saline geosystems in terms of typing the kerogen in ancient source rocks and what characteristic biomarkers are indicative of, at least periodically, hypersaline conditions. Then we'll look at a number of saline depositional styles in the Holocene where organic enrichment is currently occurring, and then we'll finish off this discussion with a look at a variety of ancient mesohaline source rocks that are productive in terms of facilitating the accumulation of oil, gas and base metals. We're going to return to a topic first noted by Doug Kirkland and Bob Evans back in the early 80s. We're going to look at what could be called the Flamingo connection, and we'll look at how flamingo numbers, in terms of the lesser flamingo, fluctuate in response to changes in environmental conditions in a number of mesohaline lakes in the African Rift Valley. And the connection that we're going to look at is how bird numbers are fluctuating in response to fluctuations in their major food source, which is a particular form of cyanobacteria that periodically thrives in a number of these African Rift Valley lakes. And all of these lakes are characterized by fluctuating or schizohaline, mesohaline salinities. I term this response in numbers a response to conditions of what I would call feast or famine. The life of the lesser flamingo is very well adapted to flourishing in these conditions of feast or famine in these African Rift Valley lakes. So let's look first of all at times of plenty, times when the biota, the cyanobacterial phytoplanktic biota in these Rift Valley lakes is flourishing, and we'll call this life in times of feasting, when there is abundant food, especially phytoplankton, in the lakes for the flamingo population. These lakes at times of feast are world famous. Here's Lake Bogoria in Kenya, formerly called Lake Harrington, and on the margins of this lake, up to 1 million flamingos can visit this lake to feed. Another nearby lake, Lake Nakuru, also supports large numbers of flamingos when conditions are right for a flourishing phytoplankton population in that lake. This lake is described by aviators flying over this lake as being like a crucible of pink and crimson fire. So let's look at a video from the BBC and how this description is apt and appropriate.
Lake Bogoria is even more volcanically active. Its shores are fringed by steam vents and gushing geysers. As with Lake Natron, volcanic minerals enrich Bogoria's waters, providing an ideal environment for even larger flocks of flamingos. At the height of the season, there may be over 1 million birds. Flamingos are famous for their extraordinary courtship rituals.
And here is a listing of the number of birds that thrive in the various Rift Valley lakes of Kenya and Tanzania, as well as lesser flamingo numbers in a number of other mesohaline lacustrine settings around the world. And you can clearly see that the highest numbers occur in the African Rift Valley lakes, especially in Kenya, but also in Tanzania. But it's also obvious, looking at these numbers, that numbers of birds can fluctuate drastically according to the seasons. And we'll look at the reasons for this fluctuation in bird numbers across the range of the lesser flamingo. So let's have a look at where the birds tend to feed and the conditions and the food sources where they tend to flourish. Lake Bogoria and Lake Nakuru are the two of the main feeding sites, but there are a number of others depending on salinity conditions and phytoplankton makeup, and others can include Elementia and Alidia, where flamingo numbers can be very high, but in all these lakes they tend to oscillate. The lakes where we find the flamingos are found along the axis of the African Rift. Here's Lake Baringo, Lake Bogoria, Lake Nakuru, Lake Elementia, Lake Nabatia. And then we have the nesting sites where the flamingos tend not to feed. They can feed there if there's suitable halotolerant cyanobacteria populations, but they tend to nest. And these are predominantly Lake Natron and occasionally Lake Magadi. Lake Nakuru is a relatively shallow lake, and its water levels and salinities tend to fluctuate, as does the position of the shoreline. Likewise in Lake Bogoria and all of the other Rift Valley lakes, where salinities are not constant, they are fluctuating. These are mesohaline, schizohaline lacustrine systems. Let's look at how the flamingo feeds. And in this, it's a rather unique bird in that it is more akin, in terms of its feeding approach, to that of a whale. Like a baleen structure in a whale, the flamingo also has a filtering grid or meshwork in its beak that acts in the same way. Behind that filtering mesh in its beak is a very large, fatty, muscular tongue that can pump water through that filtering structure in the beak up to 4 to 5 times a second. And of course what this done is draws the plankton through the beak filter on the backward pull of the tongue and expels it on the forward pull of the tongue. And this very efficient feeding mechanism is utilized to extract phytoplankton from the various African Rift Valley lakes. And it's why the lesser flamingo can flourish in any mesohaline lake with a suitable phytoplankton population. And this is a very efficient feeding mechanism, as has been measured in the African Rift Valley lakes, where when we have a dense phytoplankton bloom, an adult bird can ingest around 72 grams of dry weight Arthrospira per day. And here we can see the feeding structure of a flamingo's beak. And in this next video, taken in the flamingo pond at the San Diego Zoo, you can see the very efficient feeding apparatus in action. Notice on the rear of the underside of the beak the fluctuation of that very muscular tongue moving water into and out of that filtering baleen up to 4 times a second. Of course, this is taken in an artificial pond where we don't have a phytoplankton bloom, but we have particulate food suitable for the flamingos. That food, by the way, does contain a food source which contains the phytoplankton which have appropriate pigmentation to allow the flamingo feathers to maintain their pink colour. Flamingos in their native habitat usually fly into the lakes and feed at night, and they'll feed for up to 12 to 13 hours in a 24-hour period. And they favour a particular phytoplankton food source known as Arthrospira fusiformis. And this has been misidentified in the past as a form of Spirulina potensis, but it's actually a separate species to Spirulina. It has very similar protein-rich properties, but it is not the same species. And for much of the average year, Arthrospira is a significant phytoplanktonic component in Lake Nakuru and Bogoria and some of the other Rift Valley lakes. And it's the levels of this particular food source, Arthrospira, in the lakes, which, with its fluctuations, tends to control the numbers of the feeding population of lesser flamingos in any particular lake. And the flamingo itself is quite nomadic in its behaviour, and it searches for lakes with particular food sources as it flies up to hundreds of kilometres in search of lakes with an appropriate level of salinity and Arthrospira as its dominant food source. Here you can see it's rather impressive in this image on the right, where you've got the Lake Bogoria where the Sandal River is coming in, and you can see those very dense populations of flamingo. This is the same site where that video was taken on the BBC you saw a little earlier in this presentation. And people have put radiolocation monitors on birds, and here are 3 of the birds that have had these radiolocation monitors put on them, and you can see how they tend to fly a number of rather large flight paths looking for food, with flown distances in periods of between a week and 3 weeks spent at each stop. The interlake distances can be upwards of 3,000 kilometres. So these birds are highly nomadic in search of a lake with an appropriate food source in that lake, and that food source is Arthrospira. Arthrospira tends to have an idealized range of both pH and salinities in which it tends to thrive. It has quite a broad thermal tolerance range where it can live in waters with temperatures of up to 35 degrees. It tends to favour waters with pHs of between 9.5 and 10, so quite alkaline waters. And it's most productive in the salinity range of 22 to 62 parts per mil, so about 2/3 to twice the salinity of normal seawater. It's one of the most productive systems when these phytoplankton are flourishing in any known ecosystem in the world. Nakuru, for example, can have biomass values of Arthrospira in the water of up to 200 to 1430 milligrams of Arthrospira per litre. This is what makes Arthrospira, like Spirulina, such a good food source. It has a protein content of up to 70%, and there's no cellulose in the cellular structure to digest, so it is highly digestible food source, and some would argue it's perhaps the richest source of phytoplanktonic nutrition per dry weight anywhere in the world, which is why it was a food source for the ancient Aztecs and why it's so freely available as a health food supplement in many health food stores today. The images on the right are showing you how dense that bloom can be. This is from Lake Bogoria, where you can see a rather impressive Arthrospirus foam, and you can see its typical closed and more open spiral structure that's characteristic of this particular species of phytoplanktic cyanobacteria. And of course, this has the idealized dimensions to be captured by the baleen structure in the filtering apparatus of the flamingo beak. So now that we've looked at the food source and the nature of the feeding structure and the lifestyle of the flamingo, let's look at the breeding cycle. The flamingo tends to breed in one mating site in Africa, and that is Lake Natron. Lake Natron is a trona-filled volcanic depression within the African Rift, and breeding tends to take place between October and December, which follows the second lesser rainy season in this tropical setting, where the mud is sufficiently wet for nest building, but lake levels are also low enough to allow the birds to breed on particular positions in the lake. And breeding is done most efficiently in years where floodwaters have only partially receded from the lake, leaving regions of dry islands still surrounded by hot alkaline brines. And there are actually two areas that are suitable as breeding sites in the lake. One is in the south at the foot of the Gilai volcano, where in the central portions of the lake, behind what's called a moat unit or a moat facies, a perennial alkaline brine lake, breeding takes place in the central positions of the lake behind that moat. And this is site 1 in this particular image. And then to the north, near the Champollion volcano, there is also on the actual Trona platform itself a series of nesting sites where nesting occurs around the shallot areas surrounding the upturned polygonal edges, the megapolygon edges of Trona salt crusts. And you can see how breeding takes place as lake levels oscillate. And here is a plot of the fluctuations in the lake levels across the period from 1985 to 2012. And you can see that the surface area of the lake expands and contracts with the seasons. And that when areas or water levels are appropriate, flamingos move in to these two breeding sites and set up a series of nesting mounds on these sites. Here we can see the nest mounds as well as a flock of flamingos on Lake Natron. And here is the other site. This is site 1, looking across the moat facies toward the southeast and the Gilai volcano. And so you can see here how on the edge of that moat, which is full of alkaline brine, you really can't swim in that brine. It prevents predators from approaching, especially hyenas and other mammalian predators, from approaching the egg site from the mainland. And then to the north, here is the second site, the breeding site, where you can see nest mounds around the edges of these megapolygonal structures on the Trona crust. You can also see a few flamingos flying across this region on the northern end of the breeding sites. Now, as you can tell, this is a pretty inhospitable place to breed. Some ornithologists have described it as breeding taking place in the forecourt to hell. The flamingos construct nests that are about up to half a metre high, and there's a crater-like hollow in the middle of these mud mounds, these nests they construct, where they lay their eggs. Typically, the temperatures, they can range from 50 to 75 degrees in the surrounding areas, but the chimney effect with evaporative cooling lowers the actual nest crater temperature to around 25 degrees centigrade. Once again, rather inhospitable for any sort of predator to come out and reach the nesting site. Now, the females don't breed every year. It depends on feeding conditions and the health of the population. And when they do breed, they lay only one or more rarely two eggs in the nest crater. Timing of that breeding is most successful when it's done in combination with the evolving saline flat hydrology in Lake Natron. And here we can see the flamingos on their nest mounds when those mounds are still surrounded by a very hot alkaline brine. Ideal conditions for maintaining the safety of the breeding young. Now, there are problems because these are lacustrine environments and water levels fluctuate in lacustrine environments. If the flamingos return to Lake Natron when water levels are high, the nesting areas aren't appropriately exposed. And this happened, for example, back in the early 60s when the breeding population returned to Lake Natron and found it was still flooded, and so they flew on to breed in Lake Magadi. And the problem was that in Lake Magadi, where the breeding was taking place, the chicks, when they moved out from the breeding nest, moved out into a brine, not a mudflat, but into a brine, which was trona saturated. And so they had trona forming as anklets around the chicks. And of course, the chicks became exhausted, dragging this extra weight around, and many thousands were collapsing into the brine and drowning and dying. And so there was a huge cry that went out to the world's university students, who came back in and physically removed those trona anklets from the breeding cycle. And it's a rather interesting aside that there was one enterprising geology graduate amongst those coming in to help, and that particular geological graduate, like all geologists, brought along his geological hammer to do a bit of geology on the side. And what he found was that if you lay a flamingo chick over its nest and then use your geological hammer and give the anklet a good whack, it was quite an efficient way of removing the anklet without damaging the legs of the chick. Prior to that, the veterinarians and the zoologists and the ecologists had all been approaching it rather delicately with the instrument of their trade, but they could not keep up with the rate at which the trona was accumulating as anklets. It was only this enterprising geology student that discovered a rapid way of removing the anklets. And of course, after that, a cry went out for the supply of geological hammers to save the flamingo population. Anecdotes aside, what we're looking at here is a population which is under stress in its breeding environment, both in terms of the food levels and in terms of the nesting sites, which have to be appropriate in these saline flats for the population to breed and to flourish. And of course, there are many times within any hypersaline environment where salinity fluctuations and temperatures don't follow a particular pattern but tend to fluctuate and to oscillate, typical of all schizohaline, mesohaline, shoal water settings. This leads us into the next topic of the flamingo connection, and that is that populations tend to fluctuate. And there are times in any breeding cycle, looking at it from a decade-long perspective, where we get episodes of flamingo dieback. And we can think of these as times of famine. These are times when the flamingo population suffers periodic population crashes. And we see many dead birds. And this is Lake Bogoria, for example, in December 2013, where there was a salinity decrease in the lake, meaning that the Arthrospira food source was replaced by a less protein-rich set of alga and cyanobacteria, and the bird population became stressed, and there were many deaths occurring because of that stressed population. Now, in 2013, that was indicative of a flooding of Lake Bogoria, as we'll see in a moment, and there was an appropriate salinity decrease. But in Lake Nakuru, back in 2006, once again, there was a dieback of flamingos, but in this case, it was tied to a salinity increase in the waters, like a desiccation, a lowering of water level in Lake Nakuru. And so the phytoplankton makeup changed into a population which was more appropriate for those elevated salinities. But once again, the level of Arthrospira, because it could not survive well in high salinity waters, fell back. And so we had less efficient food sources for the flamingo population. So flamingos we tend to think of as flourishing, but there are certainly natural times in the life cycle of a flamingo when conditions are not appropriate salinity-wise, nutrient-wise in the lakes for Arthrospira, and the flamingo population becomes stressed. It's also why it tends to be able to fly large distances, interlake distances, as we saw earlier, to move from one lake to another. So it's always trying to optimize its food source by moving into a lake where Arthrospira is the dominant food source in that lake. And so if we look at the history of diebacks in the African Rift Valley Lake, we can see that there are many situations or many times in many lakes where salinities have changed, and we've had a dieback or a crash in bird numbers associated with those changes in conditions appropriate for Arthrospira flourishing in those lakes. So we can conclude that in any mesohaline Rift Valley system where flamingos are found, the hydrologies will vary, and that because of that, the salinities and the water levels will fluctuate as the lakes either flood and freshen or dry up and become salinized or more saline. So here, for example, is the conditions with the lake water levels across Lake Nakuru, and you can see that that lake level on an annual cycle from 1930 to 2000 fluctuates. Sometimes we have times when lake levels are relatively high, other times we can have times when lake levels are relatively low, and at times, for example, in the mid-80s, the lake can almost completely desiccate. And here's a detailed chart of gauge water depths in Lake Nakuru, and you can see how salinities fluctuate, or water depths in this case fluctuate I should say, and associated with those changes in water depths we get changes in salinity, so that at times of lower depth we see higher salinities where the total surface area is reduced and evaporation is causing an increase in salinity, and other times the lake becomes flooded, and so we have much higher water depths in that lake, and we're seeing fluctuations in conductivity or salinity. In that period in the late 90s, 97, salinities were quite high in the lake, but then the lake passed into a system in 99 and onwards when salinities were quite low. And of course is that if we look at the numbers of flamingos over those periods, dependent on whether Arthrospira is flourishing in the Nakuru waters or it is not doing so well, the number of feeding flamingos will fluctuate. And so here you can see, for example, in 97, which was a time of quite elevated salinity, Arthrospira numbers were low and the number of feeding flamingos fell. Whereas in 96, Arthrospira numbers were quite high, good source of food for the flamingos, and so the number of flamingos that moved into the lake were quite high. And of course this is a problem with all mesohaline, schizohaline, perennial shallow water systems. Salinities fluctuate, the biota fluctuates as the salinities fluctuate. And there's now a real problem in Lake Nakuru for the tourist industry, because since 2013 or 2012, Lake Nakuru has been in a period of relatively high water. And here you can see the situation from this image, this satellite image on the left from December 2010 with a well-developed shoreline, and the tourist trade was doing quite well. And then we have the situation today where the lake is filled and waters are fresh and Arthrospira is not flourishing in Lake Nakuru, and so the flamingo population has moved on. So here's the famous Baboon Hill lookout looking into Lake Nakuru in the pre-2013 view, and here is that same view in September this year where the lake is now flooded. And this is the national park entrance to the Nakuru Park. So obviously flamingo numbers are low, and the tourist industry, which supports much of the local population, is not doing so well. And it's not just Lake Nakuru, it's also Lake Bogoria and Lake Baringo, both of which are tourist sites in the Rift Valley Lake where flamingo numbers are low. Here's Lake Baringo. This is a much fresher water, a lake where you have hippopotami and a number of other wildlife on show and visible. And this is the tourist lodge, which was once on the edge of the lake, but as you can see now, it's not quite on the edge of the lake. It's actually starting to be within the lake. Now, once again, the popular press makes noises of ecological disaster, and it's all human-induced climate change. But I would make the point that these oscillations and these fluctuations are a natural system. Climate change may once again be exacerbating the problem, but this is a natural freshening and salinization profile that typifies the African Rift Valley mesohaline, schizohaline hydrologies. And if we plot up the years when flamingo numbers are elevated versus salinity and look at the levels of Arthrospira, you can see that there is a very good correlation to high flamingo numbers when the salinities are in that optimal 22 to 60 range for Arthrospira growth. And here you can see the problem we have in Nakuru and also in Bogoria, where for the last almost decade, since 2013, we've had fresh flooded conditions in many of the Rift Valley lakes. And so Arthrospira proportions are low, and so because their food source is low, the number of flamingos is also low. Here's Lake Elementia, once again showing you the same thing, and Lake Aleden showing the same thing, where we are seeing decreasing Arthrospira numbers post 2013 because of freshening of those lakes. It can go the other way, as we saw back in 1997 in Lake Nakuru, when the waters became too saline and the proportion of Arthrospira in the food source phytoplankton population decreased. So we can see that there's a definite connection between conditions of feast or famine. So in the African Rift Valley lake systems, when we have dense populations of Arthrospira fusiformis living at their preferred range of temperature and salinity and alkalinity, there is an abundant food source for the flamingo population. But at times when salinities pass out of that optimal range for Arthrospira, either too saline or too fresh, then the level of Arthrospira as the proportion of the protein source for the flamingos decreases and the populations become stressed and can collapse. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about this notion of feast or famine characterizing mesohaline environments in many saline systems. The Flamingo connection in the African Rift Valley lakes is just one of a number of examples where you can see how salinities control the halotolerant biota, and how as that halotolerant biota flourishes and then goes into a time of famine, we can have pulses of organic matter being produced and perhaps even sinking to the floor of the lakes, versus times when there's much less organic production and lower volumes in the lake. And we can see this in this chart. This is from chapter 9 in my book 2016, where I'm breaking it out into two types of salinity. The perennial stable hydrologies above the red arrow versus the feast and famine hydrologies, the schizohaline hydrologies below the red arrow. And we can see how if salinities are stable, we will get long-term, highly specialized halobacteria, halophilic bacteria and halophilic archaea flourishing in those systems. But we'll also have very effective decomposition of that organic matter in that same scenario. Whereas if we have schizohaline hydrologies, fluctuating salinities in that mesohaline realm, we have these opportunistic species such as Arthrospira fusiformis, which will flourish when conditions are appropriate but will die back when salinities either become too saline or too fresh for those species to exist. And as we'll see later in the course, this fluctuating level of organic productivity can be tied to source rock potential in perennial mesohaline, schizohaline brine bodies. So, to conclude, what is feast and famine? Is describing the conditions where the macrobiotal numbers, which in this case we talked about the Flamingo connect, include the bird population, fluctuate as the microbial base level of productivity fluctuates within that schizohaline system. And it's not just in the African Rift Valley we see this. We can look at the pelican connection in Lake Eyre in South Australia, and the lake is subject to periodic flooding. And when it does, the halotolerant biota, phytoplankton, and the fish dependent on that phytoplankton flourish in that lake, where at other times the lake is completely desiccated. It's a salt flat. There's no perennial water body in Lake Eyre. It fluctuates from conditions of typical salt flat into the flooded situation where it becomes a relatively freshwater lake. And it's at those freshwater lake times when the flamingos move in to that system. So we'll look at one example of this in the 89 to 90 flood, where something like 200,000 pelicans, which is 80% of the total pelican population of Australia, were living in Lake Eyre. And they came there both to feed and to nest. So let's have a little bit of a look at what happens when these lakes flood. The colours here, by the way, are indicative of the phytoplankton population that's growing. So we've got the green algal and the red cyanobacterial, halobacterial populations in this system. And when these lakes are flourishing with a cyanobacterial population and an algal population, the flamingos move in and feed on this flourishing phytoplanktic population in these lakes. red colour is indicative of the pigmentation in the phytoplankton, as is the green colour. So, this is showing you the same fluctuation in the avian population now in terms of pelicans as it relates to inflows that fill Lake Eyre. So on the left we have a couple of gauging stations of the ephemeral rivers that flow into the lake, and you can see that in the 1990 flood that was very quickly followed by a drastic increase in the total number of water birds in the lake that included something like 200,000 pelicans, which, as I said earlier, was something like 80% of the total pelican population around Australia. So these idealised feast conditions are encouraging a bird population to move to the lake to feed and to nest. And of course, with ongoing evaporation, we see the salinities in those waters increase, and ultimately the phytoplankton and the fish feeding on those phytoplanktons can no longer take the elevated salinity conditions, and they die and they're washed up onto the edge of the lake. At the same time, thousands of unfledged chicks die because they can't fly back to the coast, whereas the fledged chicks accompany the adult population back into the coastal environment. So if we look at productivity and diversity in a number of ecosystems around the world, we can see that Lake Bogoria and Lake Nakuru are highly productive. Lake Nakuru, as I said earlier, is one of the most productive, if not the most productive, continental water body anywhere in the world. And it's highly productive in an ecosystem which is a schizohaline system where salinities, temperatures and alkalinities are oscillating from times of freshening to times of salinization. So in any schizohaline geosystem, the biomass levels tend to fluctuate. And this is an underpinning of one of the main reasons why we see such good levels of potential source rock development in many saline environments, both modern and especially in the past, at times of platform and basin-wide evaporites. It tends to be a system where we see increasing environmental stress. The biomass levels initially go up, but then we see a passage into more hypersaline conditions and levels of biomass rapidly decrease, and we see pulses of organic matter being deposited. So if we go back to the African Rift Valley lakes, we can see that the organic rich sediments in the lakes characterize a number of these perennial lake bodies. And if we look at any of these schizohaline, mesohaline lakes, Tanganyika, Malawi, Kivu, Baringo and Magadi, we get quite elevated levels of TOC, which in some of these stratified lakes, especially those with steeper sides and perennial water bodies, we can get laminites on the floor of those lakes which have TOC levels, which are hydrogen-rich alganites, where we have in excess of 10% TOC. And as I said, we'll come back to this when we look at the effects of brine stratification in this system a little later. But to finish off this module on feast and famine, we can conclude that hypersaline settings with fluctuating salinities are levels of organic feasting or famine. And at times of feasting, the levels of organic productivity in these systems are very high due to the rapid growth of a flourishing halo-tolerant opportunistic phytoplankton, which in the case of the East African Rift Valley lakes is also that very protein-rich Arthrospira fusiformis. But as salinities fluctuate and become too fresh or too saline for Arthrospira, there's an associated dieback both of the main halo-tolerant plankton biomass levels and of those things that are dependent on them, which in the case of the African Rift Valley lakes are the filter-feeding lesser flamingos. And so Most importantly, in terms of our conclusions for feast and famine, in a perennially stratified schizohaline hydrology, there will be pulses of organic matter settling to the organic floor of any perennial stratified lake or seaway, depositing subaqueous organic rich lamanites. We don't see organic accumulations where we have saline flats, as we have in the saline mudflats of Lake Eyre and Lake Frome and Lake Torrens, because in those systems with desiccation comes oxidation of those organic rich components in the lake sediments, and so we see low preservation potential in that scenario. As we'll see in the next module or two, we really need perennial brine stratification in meromictic situations to allow a good level of organic preservation in the subaqueous lamanites on the lake floor.